Welcome everybody. Now first I'd just like to pay my respects to the Ngunnawal people on whose land we're meeting. But we should also remember all past Indigenous peoples from Sydney Cove all the way to the Kimberleys who suffered from the onslaught of white settlement. So now, as most of us will know, in April 1789 a catastrophic epidemic of smallpox swept through local tribes near Port Jackson. This was a time when Aboriginal tribes were actively and successfully resisting settlers from the First Fleet. This outbreak was recorded by several fleeters, for example David Collins, and he wrote, "Early in the month and through its continuance, the people whose business called them down the harbour daily reported that they found, either in excavations of the rock or lying upon the beaches and points of different coves which they'd been in, the bodies of many of the wretched natives of this country." Now I'm just going to interrupt the flow here to give some information on smallpox itself. Note how Collins mentioned that they were finding bodies early in the month. This suggests smallpox was released in late February. We can see this from the time it takes to contract and develop the disease. Now this slide shows the progression of the disease from the first infection to when it manifests, first as a dramatic temperature rise and formation of a rash, and then to death or recovery. As bodies were found in early April 1789, and they were probably dead a few days, from this chart we can see that these cases must have contracted the disease over 3 weeks before. The green shading indicates the timing of deaths from smallpox. This suggests the middle of March. However, if smallpox was first spread by blankets, the first cases are not usually fatal, as the infection is only through cuts and abrasions on the skin. It is when these first cases subsequently infect their colleagues, who breathe the fresh virus into their lungs, that fatal smallpox emerges. So the first release was probably a fortnight or so earlier. This suggests late February or early March 1789. And we will have a close look at this period later. Now the outbreak may have killed over 90% of nearby native families, and maybe 3/4 or half of those between the Hawkesbury River and Port Hacking. It also killed an unknown number of Jervis Bay and west of the Blue Mountains. Now in the past, some authors have argued that the First Fleet had no involvement whatsoever in the outbreak, and there is a huge array of misconceptions by several academics who seek to deny British responsibility. And I'll deal with 3 main arguments here. The first argument of denial argues that the bottles of smallpox carried by the First Fleet would have been sterilised by heat experienced by the fleet as it crossed the equator and during 2 hot summers in New South Wales. Now we know the First Fleet had bottles of smallpox. This was reported by a Marines captain, Captain Tench. And 2 authors maintaining that the material was inactive due to heat are Judy Campbell and Alan Frost. However, these 2 did not look at the temperatures recorded during the voyage or at Sydney Cove. Also, they did not refer to any of the research on how smallpox virus in scabs lost activity over long periods in normal circumstances. When this is done, it is clear that the First Fleet bottles of smallpox may have weakened somewhat, but clearly could still retain plenty of virus if released in large amounts. And the details of this were published in the journal Aboriginal History in 2007, practically 10 years ago. Now this slide shows that even if the virus weakened to around half strength, it could easily have caused the epidemic if spread amongst local tribes. So after 6 years, there's still at least 12,000 viable particles in each individual scab. Now, we do not know how fresh the smallpox materials were, as they are not listed in the official list of medicines supplied to the First Fleet. Possibly they were obtained in Rio de Janeiro or even Cape Town. Now, the second main argument that the First Fleet was not responsible for smallpox is the Macassan argument. This argument appears to have originated as a corruption of several reports to the Royal Society of South Australia in 1882. These reports suggested that Macassan visitors may have communicated smallpox in the 1860s with no relevance to 1789. Nonetheless, several authors have tried to associate Macassan visitors with the 1789 outbreak, claiming it was caused by smallpox from the Celebi Islands 3,000 miles away, which just happened to coincide with European settlement. Now, this slide just shows the track from Sulawesi or Celebes from Makassar down to two sites on the North Australian continent and the associated trade routes. And you can see that the January trade winds bring the boats from Makassar, and then the July trade winds in the opposite direction take them back home again. In 2008, the Macassan theory was refuted in the Journal of the Royal Australian Historical Society by Craig Meir. However, it was revived by the Cambridge History of Australia, published in 2013. And this publication by Cambridge University was substandard and lazy, as it did not understand the complexity of Aboriginal trade and communication lines, nor the relative isolation of the Cumberland Plain, which we can see here. We know the Macassans set up temporary camps along Australia's northern coastline while processing sea cucumbers for the Chinese market. However, there was no smallpox at Makassar around the time of the First Fleet. The Dutch maintained medical services there for most of the 18th century, and the very first report of smallpox only occurred in 1789, far too late for it to have caused the First Fleet epidemic thousands of miles away near Sydney Cove. Furthermore, if smallpox entered northern Australia and spread across the continent, it would have left telltale evidence in the form of pockmarks along several of the spreading native trade routes, as shown here. Children along these routes who suffered smallpox in the 1780s would have been in their 40s when Europeans started spreading from Sydney Cove. But there are no reports from earlier explorers of smallpox scars in inland Australia consistent with the Macassan theory. On the contrary, as late as 1824, explorers arriving into different areas were reporting that smallpox was unknown amongst Aboriginal tribes, that local clans were free of disease, and that their skins were sleek and without a blemish. So it appears there was no smallpox spreading across Australia in the 18th century. Now, the third main argument argues that the outbreak was not smallpox, but a severe form of chickenpox. This argument has been promulgated recently in the Sydney Morning Herald and in the Canberra Times. Hypothetically, a first fleeter with shingles could have infected Aborigines with this virus, which then manifested as a virulent form of chickenpox. However, every eyewitness were unanimous that the disease was smallpox. When the chickenpox theory was floated by Richard Higston in 1985, it was immediately rebutted by a leading virologist, Professor Frank Fenner. Professor Fenner specialised in smallpox and noted that if chickenpox was present, it would have been seen amongst First Fleet children. Fenner also raised another problem. In late 1828, smallpox erupted in central New South Wales. A military surgeon, John Mair, investigating the epidemic, reported that those natives with marks from previous smallpox were now immune from catching the disease. Now, the point here is that no other disease but smallpox could have arrived with the First Fleet to generate this immunity. Mair's report therefore clearly demonstrates that the earlier outbreak was true smallpox. Extracts from Mayor's report have been available since 1919. They were published by the Australian Government in John Cumpston's History of Smallpox in Australia. It is now not reasonable to reintroduce chickenpox theory today without addressing the issues raised by Fenner nearly 30 years ago. First Fleet surgeons would have been able to distinguish severe smallpox from chickenpox by the nature of the pustules and their distribution on the body. Now, the next slide is a bit graphic, but this is exactly what would have confronted the first fleeters. Here we see very few pustules on the torso and very dense pustules on the extremities, the hands and the feet. Chickenpox is the exact opposite. Most chickenpox eruptions are on the torso with fewer eruptions, if any, at the extremities. Another difference is the nature of the pustules, and as First Fleet surgeons examined cases closely, their opinions must be taken as accurate. It is not possible to confuse an epidemic of severe smallpox with any other disease, including chickenpox. Also, it's worth noting that when smallpox was eradicated, most of these other supposed diseases also disappeared. So now we'll turn to the main issue. Was the release a deliberate act, and by who? Aboriginal oral history has probably always known that the British were responsible for smallpox. However, it was Noel Butlin who famously brought this to the attention of the wider community. In 1983, Butlin wrote, "Smallpox could have been used deliberately as an exterminating agent. It is possible and quite likely the British deliberately opened Pandora's box." In 2001, Dennis Foley published an example of oral history. According to Foley, the oral tradition reported that at Balmoral there were blankets with red markings, a stripe of words or a crown, and that those who took the blankets died a horrible death of fire under the skin and the pus of 1,000 festering sores. This oral history is particularly useful because it can be corroborated independently. The description of a stripe of words or a crown is similar to navy blankets of the era. Examples as replicas can be seen today at the National Maritime Museum in Sydney, which is on this slide. First Fleet blankets would have had lettering from the symbol of George III that was branded on government property. The description of fire under the skin is accurate, as it is also the description given by those who suffered smallpox elsewhere. And the location of Balmoral is also accurate, as this is a site where numerous remains have been found, as we can see from the strange concentration of skeletons mapped here in 1964. There are also concentrations of remains near Narrabeen, Botany Bay and Middle Harbour, plus on the north side of Port Hacking. These are consistent with the release of smallpox at Balmoral and at Botany Bay, with some natives dying as they fled north and south. We now need to consider who could have released smallpox and why. It should come as no surprise that the British released smallpox, as they had already used it against North American tribes on more than one occasion in the 1760s. While this tactic was never reported in official records, it certainly was recorded in British culture. Here is an example. In 1826, the Sydney Gazette referred to selling blankets full of smallpox to uncivilised nations. And using smallpox was also advocated by a British Major, Robert Donkin, and he spent some time serving with the Marines. It is worthwhile having a close look at the circumstances impacting on the 4 companies of Marines sent out to protect the settlement. The main problem for the Marines was they departed England in May 1787, but left all their ammunition behind. They also left their tools to repair their flintlocks behind as well. So when the fleet pulled into Santa Cruz in June 1787, Governor Arthur Phillip sent a plea back to Evan Nepean at the Home Office, requesting that the missing ammunition be sent out with William Bligh's ship, the Bounty. Presumably this was the only reason Phillip felt it was safe to continue the voyage beyond Cape Town. Now the critical point here is that unfortunately the missing ammunition was never sent. Although the Marines obtained 10,000 musket balls at Rio de Janeiro, but this was only 50 balls per musket, this would not have lasted more than 12 months. Musket balls by themselves are pretty useless as you need cartridge paper and gunpowder. Also, this supply was so insignificant that even after obtaining his 10,000 musket balls, Phillip sent another letter to Evan Nepean seeking more musket balls, cartridge paper and repair tools. And then, once established at Sydney Cove, Phillip yet again sends a request to England for ammunition and tools to repair their muskets, but by now it was too late. By 1789, the Marines would have thought that their supplies requested earlier had been sent, but that the ship must have met with an accident and therefore that their supplies were never going to arrive. This must have created serious concern. And there is another factor. The number of Marines was just 160 privates, plus sergeants and officers, up to a total of 212. Such a small force was unable to both supervise the convicts and protect the settlement, which had spread away from Sydney Cove, and much less to protect some far-flung outstation at Parramatta. On this slide we see the extent of the early settlement from Major Ross's farm at Balmain, the settlement at Sydney Cove, and farming at Farm Cove and Garden Cove. This is quite a large area. Captain Tench told Phillip that they could not spare Marines from Sydney to protect convicts at Parramatta. Nonetheless, in October 1788, Phillip ordered a number of Marines be sent to Parramatta, and initially only 11 Marines were sent. But this seems to have been inadequate, as the number rapidly increased to 17, and then in the middle of February 1789, 21 Marines were now serving at Parramatta. On top of this, over a dozen Marines had died or were unfit for service, and another 20 or so were on the sick list, although some of these losses were made up with transfers from Marines from the Sirius and Supply, but this was just 8. We also need to recognise that the Marines' main weapon, flintlock muskets, were not effective against Aboriginal weapons. Muskets were inaccurate at moderate ranges or against moving targets. They misfired and they needed reloading after every shot. They had no rear sight and only a rudimentary foresight that was obscured when a bayonet was attached. After an initial period, Sydney Aboriginals were becoming used to muskets and less likely to scatter when confronted with them. In all these circumstances, with no resupply and a dire need to expand the settlement, some Marines must have viewed their predicament, and therefore that of the settlement, as on the verge of total calamity. And the period around the end of February and the beginning of March is of interest, not only because of the nature of the disease cited earlier, but because this was when a particularly serious conflict between convicts and natives occurred. And this resulted in another death of a convict, making 6 in all. And this could well have been the straw that broke the camel's back. At this point in time, the release of smallpox may have occurred as a weapon of last resort. In 2009, Michael Bennett concluded that smallpox was released from the First Fleet, but he suggested this was a deliberate act by rogue Marines or convicts. Where I differ from Bennett is that a close examination of the circumstances suggests that some official authority, not necessarily involving Governor Phillip, ordered the deployment of smallpox when local tribes were possibly poised to overrun the settlement and win the first frontier war against invaders. We can be confident that the spread of smallpox was officially authorised because, as we saw earlier, it occurred on the opposite side of the harbour from the settlement and down the harbour at Balmoral. This indicates that boats were used for smallpox deployment, which would have required official planning and sanction, because any Marines leaving Sydney Cove without permission were court-martialled. From what we've just gone through, it is clear that the disease was certainly smallpox, that it was certainly released from the First Fleet by someone with authority to take boats out of the harbour, just when the Marines were running out of ammunition, and when they were running out of manpower, and just when it looked like they were about to lose the First Frontier War. This was obviously a deliberate act by the British, as proposed by Noel Butlin over 30 years ago. And here endeth the story. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Well done.
Done.
Yeah, excellent research.
And that didn't take too long after the landing of the
18 months.
1788.
18 months.
Yes.
You
That was
decided
all
we're
just
gonna-
went through, everyone was
Colonies at
killed.
risk.
Colony
Yeah.
was.
Yeah, we're going to wipe them out.
Yeah.
It even went down to Jarvis Bay, down
Yes.
there.
Yes.
But
But smallpox also came out at Wallaga Lake too.
now,
That was a little
yes,
bit later down the track, but it did.
yes, yeah, there were several incidences of it.
Yeah.
And it's a bit funny, isn't it? But that little report in the Gazette in 1826, indicating, smallpox could be used against native people.
Yes.
2 years later, 1828, that's when it spread the second time.
Yeah.
So it's a very suspicious thing,
That's right.
Yeah, but I haven't done much in that area. But of course, all the academics say, "Oh no, that was Macassar." But it spread from near Dubbo, where the British had set up Fort Wellington, the Wellington Valley, and there was conflict with the native tribes there, probably Wiradjuri. So it's the same system. You have no smallpox. The British come here, they set up a fort and a colony, they have conflict, and then smallpox spreads. Well, draw your own conclusions, in the same, so it's quite a...
That's right.
yeah.
And they had it wasn't also just with the purchasing of the blanket. It was also with the issuing of the blanket.
Yes,
Because the Aboriginal gathered in certain areas for
to receive the blankets.
receive blankets.
Now, I think that probably happened not in the for 1789 outbreak, but possibly for the 1828, because that was instituted. I think it was probably Macquarie,
Macquarie, yeah.
possibly, or something.
Yeah, they've been gathering at Parramatta.
Yeah, but we do need people to sort of dive into all the documents and do research on all of this, because it's all yet to be
It's all
uncovered.
relevant and needs to be
Yeah, it needs to be
together.
done and
And
spread.
truth needs to be told.
That's right. You can't have reconciliation without truth.
You can't do a
You know.
treaty without truth.
Well,
How
truth,
can
yeah.
you do a treaty without
True.
truth?
That's exactly right. It's
Truth
otherwise
needs to
just
come forward.
That's right. It's just a cover up.
Yes.
Yes, indeed. Exactly right. That's how I see things. Yeah.
And reading that journal too, there was a point where Philip said he's reporting back to Britain, and he's saying there are more natives here than there were supposed to be. Now, do you know what date he said that? Because obviously, they thought people just on the coast and...
Practically the first day he arrived, they were stonkered. When they arrived at Botany Bay, they'd been misinformed by Joseph Banks when they were planning the First Fleet into the Beecham Committee, and Banks blatantly lied. He said there were very few Aborigines at Botany Bay, and they would simply retire when the First Fleet arrived, and they were inoffensive. Now, when Cook actually arrived at Botany Bay, they were actually strongly opposed by the local tribes. They'd say, "Well, Warra, Warra, go away, go away." And that's the story of the shield, because they actually fired they had to fire on the Botany Bay tribes, with musket balls to put that hole in that shield, although that's not in the official records. That hole is the only evidence. But they did...
No, it is. That's where I talked with Paul Daly, because he said that the British Museum said it was a lancet hole. But if you go back to the original, they say they fired small shot.
Yeah, the records say small shot,
Small
exactly
shot,
right, or bird
whereas
shot.
by the time they got up to Queensland,
Yeah.
they'd rewritten the account and they're saying that hole was a lancet hole.
Oh, I don't believe that for a minute. I think it's a musket
I
ball
know,
hole.
it's just showing
I've
how
had a
they're
close
doing-
look at it.
How they're doing the denial.
Yes, they are. They're
And
covering
then
it.
when
Yeah.
it came over here
Yeah.
to Canberra and then over in London,
Yeah.
they were saying it was a lancet hole, and Paul Daly wrote that up on his Facebook. I said, Paul, why are you saying that?
I should
You've gotta
follow
read-
this
you've
up.
got to read this particular day. They fired small shot on the first encounter.
So they actually fired a musket balls as well.
Yeah, and they said it was small shot because you look
Yeah.
at that hole, it's obviously a bullet.
Yeah, it's
No,
about.
it's only little. It's only about that.
I'll have to go and have a
And
look when I
it'll
go to
be
London.
easy to do a DNA forensic test, wouldn't it?
On
The shield.
Shield.
depends what's on.
Yeah, that wouldn't
No,
hurt.
no.
If
When
there's
when
skin,
when
if
when
there's-
when it finally crosses
impact.
over the
Yeah.
the pressure to examine that when it's open. You know, when I know that New South Wales government has endorsed the reality of the shield,
Yeah.
but moving along, we should be demanding a forensic test
Yeah.
just to cancel all denial.
Yes, they should be able to
Yes.
tell whether it was a musket ball or a spear that went through
Yeah,
because of the
it's
different
obviously
damage.
Yeah.
But when I go over to London, I'm going to see whether I can have
a real look.
Yeah, and take a ruler and measure it and take a.
And if you look
probably-
around the back, you
Yeah.
can see it's the wood
Yeah.
splintered.
So where's it located now? British Museum,
Yeah.
Yeah.
it's on the
And
spears up.
and a plastic bag and a little set of tweezers.
and maybe steal it back.
Yeah, just a little set of tweezers to take
Yeah.
take a sample.
Yeah.
I'm recording.
Yes. We'll be lumbered.
And did you know that there's some more shields in Germany?
Yeah.
I have heard that.
Yes, Roxley discovered them.
But were they from Captain Cook, or were they because when the first fleet arrived, all the sailors from the 11 transports stole as many implements as they could to sell back in the UK. But I think the shield that we were talking about is a valid Captain Cook
Yep.
artefact, and that's important.
That is very important
Yeah.
to
Yes.
know that and to
Yeah.
test it and see,
Yeah.
to
Yes.
make corrections in relation.
Yeah.
Is it a
Yeah.
hole or is it
Is
a
it
sailor?
a piercing? Yeah.
Yes.
But getting back to the point about the numerous things, yes, when they went up Sydney Harbour, every cove was covered with the Aboriginals, and even when they went up Queensland and further out, they'll describe them as common as crows. It was a fully populated Australia.
Here they said that the place was overrun by blacks.
Yes,
There were
yes.
500
Yeah.
Queanbeyan overrun by blacks.
Yeah, and then when white settlement came through, they were reduced down to 50,000 by the Second World War, or just before, in between the wars. So it was a very tragic
It's a genocide.
and hasn't been explained properly at all.
That's
No.
what we do. That's why we do that Frontier Wars March.
Yes.
Because you've got to break that denial for younger generations to understand sovereignty. You can
Yeah.
understand it.
The
unless
process
you
by which they lost
understand the history. that's
Yeah.
And the
involved in
information
it.
is so shocking.
It's
It is so
traumatic.
shocking that it's
Yeah.
really hard first off to accept it.
Yeah.
It's very hard. It's
Yes, we haven't explored the poisonings and the well, there are reports of them just shooting natives as a matter of sport, So,
Yeah.
Yes.
so,
There
so
was.
it's a very sad story actually. And in fact, this one's not a pleasant story at all, and so it's sometimes a bit hard to relate it to
But there's a
people.
lot of recorded information in relation to the, like you were saying earlier there just a minute ago, about the poisonings,
Yes,
the water being poisoned,
the flour,
the milk being laced by
Milk.
arsenic,
yeah,
and the lead
strictly,
replaced, and yeah.
yeah.
So there's a lot of that recorded in several different places, especially one in particular who gave his recording on later history Hancock. He was interviewed on ABC and he openly admitted it in an interview where he laced the milk and water and poisoned the water holes for the Aboriginal to kill them.
Okay, so is that recording available?
It is recorded, it is available,
At the
it's
National
floating around on Facebook. Yeah.
Hancock.
And
Is Hancock the theme now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's his name? Gina Reinhardt's father.
Lanham.
That's him.
Yes. Yeah, Dame Mary Gilmore had a similar story because when she was a child, she lived in Gundagai, And her father was very concerned for any tins of strychnine that was around, because they knew that it had been used for poisoning. Yeah, so it sort of all matches. Also, Dorothy McKellar. That's not the name. There are reports in New England as well of similar stories of Aboriginals being poisoned in New England.
I think it's widespread. My husband wouldn't let our kids in the bush play with empty tins or bottles for that very reason. That's how recent it is.
So he was from Wiradjuri. And,
I think it would have been very similar to the Durrick tribe of the Sydney area, and also the Gundungurra, who were, and I come directly through both those tribes.
Right.
And they were, as it says, influenza, smallpox, you name it, and the majority of the information connected to it's a killing field all around that area.
Yes.
The tribes, both tribes, were hit heavily by armed weapons, and then following that they were forced off country, and they were moved around different places, out around Goulburn, Yass and those places, and also down the east coast of New South Wales. So there's all that needs to be weighed up when you're researching, because hey, we're still here. I'm a survivor, and so are many of our families are survivors.
And also the real killings happened when muskets were replaced by rifles.
Yes.
And then they also would start setting up native police and indoctrinating them. But it was the rifles, because there's no way the British could ever win a war just using muskets, because a musket's only fire once, then you have to reload the thing, and the only way to reload, you have to stand still and put your ramrod and put your primer in, and an Aboriginal can throw, by the time you're putting one extra shot in there, can throw, half a dozen spears at you, which come through silently without any noise or anything like that. And there is reports up in the Tiwi Islands, when they brought muskets there, they learnt quickly that if someone a distance away fired a musket, first of all there was a big spark, and if they ducked, then the bullet would just go straight over them, because there was a delay between the primer setting off the main charge. So for all intents and purposes, as long as there were only muskets, there was no way the British could sort of settle Australia, because they were just outgunned by the...
Well, they also, the Aboriginal also, Pemaway and Windradine and other warriors like that, they utilised the fogs in the mist.
Yes.
They used to hide in between that and hide behind the trees, and that's where it became into, they like a spirit. They hear 1 minute, gone the next, because they used all different materials and events to hide. Very similar to a spirit.
Yes. Anyway, so the other thing is that we shouldn't exaggerate the numbers of deaths around Sydney from smallpox, because a lot of natives actually fled. Some went down to Jervis Bay, and some went as far as about Concord. They couldn't go any further because different tribal territories. But nonetheless, the deaths was quite substantial. And there is a theory spread by some right-wing writers in Quadrant that because if you can blame disease on the demise of the Aborigines, that therefore white settlers could not be involved in any guilt whatsoever, because it was all inadvertent. Can't be blamed for spreading flus, influenza, chickenpox, measles, VD, whatever. This was all inadvertent. So you have to separate smallpox away from other diseases. Smallpox, I don't think, came through the Canberra region, because there was no linkage between the Canberra tribe and those north of Goulburn. They were more related to the South Coast tribes, and so there's only measles, which did do a bit of depopulating here as well.
I have a little concern when you said it goes as far as Nara. The people, when they were moved, went as far as Nara. My ancestry, as I said, it goes back to Durrick country and Gundungurra country. And my ancestry, they moved to Bawari, which is just around the Narra area.
Okay.
Then from Bawari down into Murrumarang. Gumblik, who married Kumi Nullaga.
Right. Further south.
That's right, Milton Nulladulla. That's
Okay.
the Murrumarang area.
Yeah.
And also Andy himself,
Right.
of Gundungurra.
Yeah.
He moved down to around Browley and those areas. It was like as if they moved back for their own safety or forced out of the Sydney region from their tribal area, their nation area, and then went back to the woman's country.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, because she was a South Coast,
Yeah.
from down the South Coast.
Right.
And he was Durrick,
Yeah.
and the other side was Gundungurra.
Yeah.
Yet they ended up down on the Walbunja,
Yeah.
the Darinji country,
Yeah.
and those countries that related to the woman.
So was the language a similar languages in all that area? Was that a language group?
Durga is
Right,
down the
yes,
coast.
that's
Then
right,
you
yeah.
have Dharawal
Yeah.
language speaking up.
Yeah. Yes. Anyway, so yeah, that's about as far as we can go.
Thank you.
Right. Well, thank you very much for
And thank you.
coming.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was excellent.
And what about, we're still trying to track it, but in the story that white people, at least they say they didn't do anything, but they had a license to kill. Now, I've heard this on several accounts. Got really close to getting one, but it didn't happen. But it's just like you have a license to go get kangaroos or staghorns in the forest. There was a license to kill Aboriginal people. Have you ever seen
Yes,
one?
not a license, but there was a proclamation by one of the governors
Yeah, Macquarie.
after Macquarie, I think, or maybe during his
Brisbane.
time. Brisbane, yes, saying that settlers had to form together for the defence of their settlements, and they did actually, in writing somewhere, they did give permission to fire on any natives who approached settlements or something like
It's
that.
in the martial law.
Martial law,
proclamation.
yes,
Yeah.
that was exactly right. Now,
Yeah.
that's
But
as
then
good
there were
enough as a license as far as I
Yeah,
can
no,
see.
but then there were individual ones that people
Now, I have
had.
heard a vague thing over in WA, but there's so many rumours and that it's a bit difficult to say whether it was right. Yes, but I have definitely come across that accusation.
If you find
before.
one, let us know. We got close
Yeah.
to Cowra,
Yeah.
where someone we know well, his daughter was working in a geriatric home with her friend.
Yeah.
She's Wiradjuri. And this old man was waving his licence to kill around, and the staff said to them, you know, he's gone a bit silly, don't worry about it. But I actually know the family he came from, and he's died now, but in that family still would be the licence to kill.
In his
Yes.
dementia, he was waving it around the hospital. Must have been on his conscience. Something was
have
going weird for him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's the closest I've got to it.
Yeah.
That would have come through when they brought that ruling in under what the gentleman was saying
Martial,
here,
yeah, but I-
proclamation of disarmament.
But that's 1823. I believe it's going on much more recently.
Yes.
Much more recently.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.